People are actually dying because environmentalists are opposed to climate constancy in capitalist settings. That's twisted when you think about it, because they're posing as a humanitarian. Welcome, everybody. Sorry for the delay. I'm Richard Salzman. And the first session today is on capitalism and the human environment. This is some material I presented elsewhere, but it's been revised and updated. Let's start with this. We start with a quiz. What comes to mind when you see this image? There's a phrase that should come to mind immediately. What? Freedom? No.
Fish out of water?
What? Louder?
Fish out of water?
Fish out of water. Who's free now? Yeah, but, well, fish out of water meaning what? Sometimes we say this about people. You know, I come to university and I'm like a fish out of water. Was something wrong? What were you going to say?
Thinking out of the box.
Thinking out of the box. I mean, this fish isn't going to survive very long, is it? So the phrase, which I guess used to be common, maybe not anymore. A fish out of water is someone at odds with their surroundings. They're in danger in some way, maybe they're not able to sustain themselves in this way. They're not going to probably succeed. And this is an obvious case of this fish looks like, is that a goldfish? Looks very eager, but I've never seen a goldfish do that, but it's a funny picture.
I have.
You have?
Yeah.
They jump out like that.
They trying to jump out of the fish trough, and the thing is, fish needs to respirate the oxygen from the water with their gills, and if they do it in the air like we do, they die very quickly. They learned as a child, so my part is having any others. So I've seen them do that.
It's not just that fish need to be in water. I mean, some of them need to be in fresh water. Some of them need to be in salt water. So even more specifically, right, not just fish out of water is out of their necessary environment, but even within water. And then some waters are good for nothing but death. The Dead Sea, too salty for any kind of fish. Well, what I'm going to talk about the next hour or so is that this is likewise for humans. Humans, too, have a optimal habitat. Notice these pictures, by the way. What's going on here? A spaceman on a spacewalk with all this stuff around him couldn't survive that without technology. He's in the environment, but he has to alter his makeup and underwater. All that paraphernalia to stay underwater for a long time, humans. Something has to be adjusted, something has to be altered to make it possible for humans to do that. Now, this is a talk about capitalism and the environment, so just a little background before I go into the features of this. This is a very interesting, maybe somewhat disturbing survey from 5 years ago, U.S. teens. So this is 13 to 17-year-olds. They're not in college yet. What do you think about climate change? Biggest answer, afraid. Smallest answer, uninterested. But guilty is on there too. So you get afraid, motivated, angry, helpless, guilty, optimistic. That optimism could be, I'm optimistic that we can stop climate change. But who knows what that means. Psychologists have long pointed out and noticed that, apart from physically incarcerating people or, torturing them or initiating force against them, one way to control them is through fear and guilt. They'll almost like control themselves. The fear will paralyze them, incapacitate them. Same thing with guilt. A lot of people will not do things. They feel guilty. I'm not going to have kids. because I don't want to ruin the planet. I'm not going to, these are trends and Gen Z trends. I'm not going to buy a car because I don't want to spoil the environment. Not a personal reason, but a environmental reason. Who's trying to control kids? Well, what about, here's a representative in the US Congress, a kid just a decade ago. Probably would have filled out the survey similarly, but says the world will end in 12 years. The kind of apocalyptic attitude. Why 12 years, by the way? I looked into this, and 12 years comes up a lot over the last 50 years in prognostications by people like this. I think it's something like, if you said 2 years, you could track the error pretty quickly. If you say 50 years, nobody cares. 12 is like the sweet spot. And I've seen 12 years starting like 1970. Not the world as we know it. She said the world is going to end. And the youngest woman ever elected to Congress again made headlines and sparked conservative criticism when she said Monday, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address, what does that mean? Climate change. It's the equivalent of World War II. What did we do in World War II? Fought the Nazis. Fought Hitler. An existential threat to many countries. So this is an existential threat to humanity, according to this view. The world's going to end 12 years if we don't address it. And why is your biggest issue how we're going to pay for it? See, it costs no object. Do this regardless of cost. Cost to what? If we're supposed to be saving this for humans, we should care about whether it's costly to humans. What if the proposed changes would be costly to humans? Here the argument is no cost. And her chief advisor, David Montgomery, this is like January 2019. 6 months later, he's interviewed by the Washington Post magazine, and he says, this is his advisor to AOC, the interesting thing about the Green New Deal, which is the law she proposed, is that it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Do you guys think of it as a climate change thing? Because it's really a how do you change the economy thing, unquote. Sounds like a Trojan horse. This is being advocated for some other reason. What do you mean change the economy? Change the entire economy. Maybe the system we know as, fill in the blank. All right, suppose we do this. Suppose we adopt the Green New Deal, if you've read it. The climate czar says it wouldn't matter anyway. Special envoy for the climate, that's not a country, I'm envoying with the climate, said that one of the only ways to curb the climate crisis, is an all-hands-on-deck global response. The U.S. could go to zero tomorrow, zero CO2 emissions, which would, not only you have to shut down the entire fossil fuel economy, but you can't exhale, because that is CO2. All right, just to be extreme about it. We can't, but if you're figuratively speaking could go to zero, we'd still have a problem. The world would still have a problem. He told Washington Post, if China went to zero tomorrow, we still have a problem. So every country has to come to the table. This is to do what? This is the single biggest multilateral global negotiation we need. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're not behaving internationally. It's an existential challenge. Existential means to the existence of humans. If we don't do this, humans are going to be wiped out. Here's the key part. The goal of the summit is to reach deals to keep the planet in reach of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Why pre-industrial? What is pre-industrial? What would you say industrial is? The Industrial Revolution. The industrial period, usually economists date starting. Anyone? When? Earlier, about 1750s. British textiles and the Industrial Revolution is roughly, factories and taking it out of the cottage industry, out of the home into factories, organized capital with machinery and steam, 1750s or so. the state of living prior to 1750? Is that what this would require? The significance of pointing to pre-industrial without anyone questioning, what do you mean? Do you mean we have to get rid of the industrial society today? What would that do to humans? One of the things on the poll was angry, very angry. And humans are bad for the environment. But see, these are not, periphery figures. Person of the year, a couple of years ago. A minor, a child, walking around on stages, berating adults for ruining the planet, threatening I won't forgive you for failing on climate change. What does it mean to fail on climate change? Humans are bad for the environment. Anytime you hear the two words, the environment, guess what the most important word is? The. What environment? What do you mean, the environment? What does that mean? I looked it up. Just start semantically. Here's what I found, just a regular dictionary. What's an environment? Your surroundings, your environs. No one uses that word anymore. Some kind of context. A habitat. That came up. A living area, an ecosystem, nature. Okay. So I was focusing on this. A habitat. I looked up habitat. It's defined as the natural home or environment of an animal, plant, or other organism. Are humans in there? We're a kind of animal. Aristotle said we're the rational animal. So we must have a habitat. We have a habitat. Habitable. The moon, not so habitable. Initially, it was inhabitable until we invented all the things that put us up there driving around cars on the moon and getting to the moon. And once again, getting under the sea, making it habitable. But many people would say, not naturally. Because it's unnatural, like to make all this paraphernalia. That doesn't exist in nature as is. By the way, why did I put the football helmets? A football field is not quite habitable unless you wear a helmet. You kill each other. So, and also the protection of the head is very interesting. The head seems to be all the most important. Not the fingers, the extremity, the head. In all the sports, right? Most of the sports. Hockey. Here's another example. Habitable, not habitable. The Korean Peninsula. Picture of it, you've probably seen this before, by satellite at night. And there's a whole bunch of lights on in the south. And in the upper corner, the capital. Why is North Korea dark at night? They go to bed early. Maybe they go to bed early. Why is it dark? There is a little blip there, probably. Pyongyang, where Kim is. They don't have any electricity of any importance to make it visible from the satellite. Now, when I present this to students, I say, you need some criteria for judging political systems or countries or economies. You can't just say good or bad, based on what standard. Now, on this standard, if the standard was human well-being and comfort and living standard, South Korea is better than North Korea. But from another standpoint, from the environmentalist standpoint, North Korea is better than South Korea. Why? Because it has no carbon footprint. Or very little, right? The carbon footprint in the North is almost non-existent. And it's significant in South Korea. North Korea is communist. South Korea is mixed, as all the systems are, but semi-capitalist. But see, if you use a different standard, you would condemn one and praise the other. Some before and afters. For what purpose? All things deteriorate if you don't maintain them. all things created by humans, they atrophy over time. The creations can be great. Industrial creations, that's the Packard Car Company in Detroit. Now, if you don't do anything, this is what it looks like. So it has to be maintained or replace it with something else. This hasn't even been replaced with anything. Why? But one's habitable and one's inhabitable. One provides jobs and income and profits and the other one doesn't. Why? Why would things go to hell like that? Michigan Central Station, 1923. Again, the idea is not, let's keep this train station going forever. Maybe we don't use trains as much, but to leave it in this condition, to tear it down and maybe put up something else? Nope. It has to be maintained. So economic progress, if you will, and development isn't automatic, isn't causeless, and can't be sustained without sustained human effort and intervention in the environment. Not a good environment for watching an opera or a movie. Not now. I think it's been torn down since, thankfully, but that's what it looked like in 1984 versus 1928. Chicago in the 1890s. That's Lake Michigan. And that's Chicago now. An advance, very unnatural in some eyes, right? The upper one, very natural, very close to the ground, very close to a lot of trees in there and stuff still. It's developing, but what if I had put up 1792? Be even less there. Back to climate. There's some old people in the room, so they'll remember that the problem used to be global cooling, roughly in the 70s. It's easiest just to get all the Time magazine covers or Newsweek or, well, Science and Mechanics said it. They follow the science. They must know what they're talking about. A new ice age imminent. The solution was curb and shut down industrial civilization. Sounds familiar? Wait a minute. Global warming. The temperature's changed a bit. The average global temperature measures changed a little bit. So now they're going up a little bit. So now the apocalyptic claim is the heat is on, Arctic meltdown, global warming. How do we curb it and stop it? Stop industrial civilization. You know, it's one of those things where, like, I suppose I have it in for Professor Hicks. And the weather's hot. And I said, Hicks did it. And then the weather is cold. Hicks did it. And someone has shoplifted down at the local Walmart. Hicks. See, at some point you'd say, Salzman has it in for Hicks. It's got nothing to do with, what is this animosity toward Hicks? That seems to be the answer no matter what's happening. Okay, now if you're wrong on global cooling or warming, you're all over the place, why not just say climate change? It's like in the stock market, like if a forecaster is very bad, he says the market's going to go up, and it doesn't. Or the market's going to go down, like it doesn't. So to save his reputation, he says, the market will change. Great, I'll always be right. Now, because it always changes. So now it's climate change, not climate up or down. It's just changing. Terrible. And the solution? Shut down and curb industrial civilization. I love this. The Washington Post magazine, the story's about 24 magazine covers talking about climate change. Okay, back to the magazine covers. It's always changed. Look at this graph, which goes back a long time, 2500 BC. Now, you can find these graphs all over the place. Some of them are more accurate than others. This one's kind of busy because it has a lot of events going on. But you can gather from this that climate constancy is what's rare. Climate change is the norm. So the idea that climate change is a problem, that can't be true. I mean, it might be true for certain species at certain times if there's deep cold or deep heat. By the way, if you've missed this, the norm is 57. Over this stretch, someone averaged at 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And at the worst point in terms of cold, 54. So that's only 3 degrees lower, but that's extreme. And the hottest, see up there, is a 58 or so, 1998. So from 57 to 58. The Industrial Revolution, of course, is just, I mean, where are we, 1854? It's basically here. So what about all there could not have been caused by the Industrial Revolution? We didn't have industry. Something else must be causing these swings. Remember, Kerry said, there's so many deniers out there. You're a climate denier. That is the criticism now. Are you going to be a climate denier? It's almost like, what does it sound like? Holocaust denier. Everyone knows the Holocaust occurred. So a really bad person, a really stupid, vicious person would say the Holocaust didn't occur. So they're a Holocaust denier. That's the first time I ever heard the denier adjective, right? So that this switch to climate denier almost sounds like an epithet, right? Well, let's consider what I call 8 stages of denial. This sounds like a psychiatrist diagnosing a patient. Because when you hear climate denier, climate? Who denies that there's a climate? There's a climate. That is so pedestrian, isn't it? Okay, so let's dispense with number 1. No one denies that the climate exists. So there's no such thing as that I know of, a climate denier. Okay, but the next level might be climate change. Well, I just showed you the graph that it changes. So anyone who knows that would know, I shouldn't be a climate change denier. That would be ridiculous too. So what would be the next level? Human factors cause this climate change, human and other factors. I think even if you deny that, that would be crazy. That would be unjustified. Because there are factors, I mean, including sun. I won't even go into the theories of it, the sun being the most important, by the way. But now humans come into the discussion, right? Well, at level 4 I have humans only. Level 4 would be humans only or primarily cause climate change. Okay, I'm suggesting 1 through 3 or 4 are not deniable and show some level of ignorance but after that, it's debatable. It's not obvious what the cause and effect of. Number 5, for example, cause and effect of climate change entail a net loss or cost to humans. That hasn't been shown yet. No one's actually done the analysis of, well, maybe if it warms enough, we get more vegetation. And CO2 creates fauna and flowers and vegetation, which is good for animals and humans. So that kind of, if you wanted to do a cost-benefit analysis, and no one's done that, so far as I can tell. So maybe it's a net benefit to humans. One way or another. What about number 6? Climate change or stopping it is good for existence X humans. What do you mean, a planet without humans? That doesn't sound like a humanistic standard. So the concern here isn't, we need to save the planet for humans. It's save the planet regardless of humans. That's the cost-free approach. Or the cost, no consequences approach of AOC and Kerry. What about 7? You could go on and on with this. It becomes more an issue of who knows. Climate change is good or bad for humans' habitat. Finally, 8. Humans can do something about it. Really? I mean, that's the policy consequence, right? They go through all this and they say, and here's what we're going to do about it. To what? Stop or curb climate change? It sounds almost hubristic. Well, it is hubristic. If humans are a small part of the cause, especially when the answer is get rid of and curb industrial civilization. It isn't just, minor changes at the edges. So beware of this terminology. I hope never again when you hear climate deniers or even climate change deniers, it's an easy way to whisk someone off as an idiot and no part of the debate. But in fact, the debate hasn't really begun until you get to level 4 or 5. So the evidence we have so far would suggest that it's actually ludicrous to even spend a cent, let alone trillions, in the Green New Deal to mitigate or eliminate, especially eliminate climate change globally. But they are advocating it by any means necessary, including political coercion, and they're doing it in the name of follow the science, which is even more maddening because it's not science. Now, what am I saying here? This last point, wait a minute. In fact, capitalism has already achieved climate constancy. What does that mean? Does anyone know what I mean? Capitalism has already delivered the constancy they want. Thoughts? What do I mean? What can I possibly be talking about? They're against climate change. They think it's a threat, so climate constancy would be the ideal, right? We have it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Carrier. Air conditioning. HVAC, the HVAC industry, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, invented by humans, changing their environment. The concept of room temperature, which we're in, by the way. I don't know how you missed this quiz part. We are in a room where there's no climate change. The climate's the same. Room temperature, the concept of room temperature. And think of all the places, too. Campus buildings, sports stadiums, offices, science lab, concert halls. There's no climate change. And people flock to these areas, but they wouldn't exist without this industry, without this very profit-seeking, profitable, capitalist, industrial, technologically advanced industry, HVAC. Actually, if you think about it, to oppose fossil fuels, to threaten the grid, so to speak, would actually erode and undermine and threaten the climate constancy we enjoy. That's starting to happen even in Europe. In France, there'll be hospitals that lose their air conditioning because they've cut down on this or that fossil fuel use, Germany and elsewhere. And people are dying in hospitals because it's too hot. People are actually dying because environmentalists are opposed to climate constancy in capitalist settings. That's twisted when you think about it, because they're posing as the humanitarians. This is a climate and an environment called a campus. This room actually is an environment, right? What's it made of? All these materials were taken from various parts of the earth, put together by engineers and builders and elsewhere, HVAC people. And they've created an environment to listen to a lecture. So the entire campus is an environment, isn't it? A hospitable environment for teaching and learning. And but it's not, quote, natural. It is. It's made by natural people called humans. And this is where we'd be if they didn't do any of that. It's a rough image, but we'd also be naked in the woods. There's no clothing industry. This is it. This is the pre-camp. That's not actually it. It's just a representative sample of what was here before. The campus was built. That was the environment. I don't see that being hospitable to learning or teaching or collaborating. You have to change things. Humans have to do something to that environment to get a better environment, to improve the environment. See the idea? I mean, this is an improvement. But lots of people don't think it's an improvement. Lots of people who, when it was that and this was proposed, people said, sure, build a campus. But there are some people who would say, leave it as is. Pristine nature is better than altered nature. All right, we already talked about definitions of the environment and the idea of a habitat. The environment, as people call it, is really not the same as, and this is how they think of it as everything that exists apart from mankind. See, so they see mankind as outside the environment. They don't think of humans as part of an environment. They're penetrating, invading, spoiling, contaminating the environment. It's a thing outside themselves. See the idea? So it excludes humans, even though humans are part of the natural world. Obviously, we're part of the natural world. And we have a unique nature, human nature. So when you hear the very common phrase that we're synthetic, that humans are unnatural, immediately think of human nature. Why would they call it human nature if it weren't a natural thing? We have a certain nature. What is that nature is important, but that gets to the issue of what is our proper habitat. But mankind is natural and part of nature, and unique to other animals, has to rearrange the elements in nature to survive. Others are passive. I'll see some quotes on that later. Other animals are more passive in their setting. Most of them are. We have a unique nature, and therefore we have a unique habitat that we need to live in. And, as already suggested, some habitats are inhospitable, hostile, even lethal to humans. First of all, the unique nature, just a reminder here. We are the species of reason. Homo sapien, what does sapien mean? Reason, thinking. We have volition, we have free will. We're not determined. We have to have a purpose in life. We can't just expect to be supported or happy without having a purpose or a mission. We need to esteem ourselves. That propels us into action, that we feel worthy and capable of action in our achievements. What kind of unique habitat for a person like that or people like that? They need to be treated as individuals, not pieces in a collective. They need to have rights, including property rights. Rights to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. They need to have wealth. Not everyone has to be wealthy, but if you don't create wealth, you cannot survive. We come on this earth naked and wealthless and helpless. And a system, capitalism, which the critics, most environmentalists are anti-capitalist, if you poll them. The system of capitalism, we'll talk a little bit more about its origins and roots, but a habitat. Capitalism is a habitat for humanity. It's the premier optimal habitat. There are inhospitable and lethal habitats and systems historically. Medievalism, in modern times, collectivism, so Soviet Union, Red China, Cuba, North Korea, Nazi Germany, the collectivist statist regimes have been lethal to human well-being. Bad habitats. Here's what Ayn Rand wrote in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, getting to this system, this habitat. A social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. Now notice the philosophy underlying this. It's the basic metaphysical fact of man's nature, there's man's nature, the connection between his survival and his use of reason that capitalism recognizes and protects. In a capitalist society, all human relationships are voluntary. Men are free to cooperate or not, to deal with one or not as their own individual judgments, convictions, and interests dictate. They can deal with one another only in terms of and by means of reason, their distinguishing faculty, right? By means of discussion, persuasion, contractual agreement, by voluntary choice, to mutual benefit. And now the kind of environmental aspect to it, which he identifies very cleverly. This is really unique. Talk about unique nature. Man is the only living species who must perceive reality, which means to be conscious by choice. Animals are conscious. Dogs are conscious. But by choice and by reflection and focus, he shares with other species the penalty of unconsciousness, destruction. But for the animal, the question of survival is primarily physical, whereas in the case of humans, it's primarily epistemological. Man's unique reward, however, is that while animals survive by adjusting themselves to their background, man survives by adjusting his background to himself. See the difference? The first one's kind of passive. The second one is they're very active. If a drought strikes them, animals perish. Man builds irrigation canals. If a flood strikes them, animals perish. Man builds dams. If a carnivorous pack attacks them, animals perish. Man writes the Constitution of the United States. A couple of years ago, I wrote the mind-based etymology of capitalism. I was doing research into capitalism, but its meaning, like where the word came from. And, you know, when ism is attached to anything, socialism, fascism, the root is interesting because ism just systematizes it. It's a systemization of the root. And capitalism is definitely a system. It's a system loved and hated, you know, but it's definitely a political, economic, including moral system, right? So the word, believe it or not, was coined only in 1850. So this is 100 years after the start of the Industrial Revolution. Many would say it was further back. No, that's the first time it shows up, and it shows up by a socialist. A French socialist coined the term and criticized it as a terrible system. So it's in my essay. You can look it up online. Louis Blanc. Now, going deeper, cap is Latin for head. If you see, there's a whole bunch of words. Cap, captain, baseball cap, capital of a city. Even the French chapters in a book, heading chapters, is a French. Heads of cattle, head. So the origin of the word is, it's like cattle, head of cattle. He's got a head of cattle, he's got capital, he's got assets. And then if he owns it, he's a capitalist. And then if there's a system that makes this possible and flourishes by protecting individual rights, and if we get into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and John Locke and constitutional government, all that was necessary before you could have an industrial revolution, and something that even a socialist could see was, this is uniquely a difference. This is capitalism. And even Marx said, yeah, it came after feudalism. It replaced feudalism. I write that the etymology of capitalism integrates seamlessly with the system to which the term refers. Capitalism is a system that respects the mind, frees the mind, is based on the mind, is driven by the mind. So there's no better name for a political economic system of the mind than capitalism. You will notice, by the way, though, that a lot of conservatives and libertarians, friends of liberty, shy away from the word. They don't want to use the word. Because it sounds like it's a system of, by, and for a subgroup called capitalists, you know, like who work on Wall Street or who are venture capitalists. See, so it sounds like a cronyist. They always call it crony capitalism. It's never crony socialism, right? So the smearing of the system is, no, it's just for a subgroup of people who happen to own things and love to exploit workers, and that's what capitalism is. But if you look at the etymology of it, it's very interesting. So I'm on a little campaign to convince people to respect the word capitalism and know its etymology. And it has a philosophic correspondent. It's very nice. It's perfect. How much time? Well, by the way, I don't want to just do this and like have Q&A at the end. If you want to, this is more classroom style, hopefully. If you want to join in, criticize, stop me. Go back. Don't hesitate. There is what I call the pillars of capitalism. And its counterpart is statism. And notice statism is the broader concept. It's the idea of prioritizing the state above all else, even to the sacrifice of individuals and groups in the state. But understand that there are versions of statism. I've already mentioned communism, socialism, fascism. They're versions of statism, and they're all opposed to capitalism. There's a long history of, if you quote people they're all anti-capitalist, and I would include now environmentalists, although that's not technically a state system, but it's also not surprisingly anti-capitalist. But now starting from the bottom, call it like the deepest roots of the tree. Capitalism is definitely based on reason and objectivity. I mean, businessmen themselves are characterized as very heartless, cold-blooded. They care about their profit and loss statements and their balance sheets, and the better ones do, actually. They don't go by emotion. They only go by facts and logic, the bottom line. But also reason in the sense of, if you're for reason and you understand that this is the essential and central attribute of human beings. Yeah, that's what we already said. Capitalism, to the extent it's respectful of that aspect of human nature, therefore it's going to be respectful of humans. And then egoism. This isn't even disputed by its foes. Most people realize Adam Smith, the first great political economist, said what? Other than division of labor and other things that cause the wealth of nations, this is 1776, one of the great things he said was, and it's driven by self-interest. And like in his moral writings, he said, it's not the most moral motive, but it definitely creates the wealth of nations. Yes. I'm going to talk later in the week about the profit motive and how it's related to self-interest. But egoism and self-interest are, call it, the first one is epistemological, right? The second one is ethics. We're talking about morality and ethics. The case for egoism and self-interest, not self-sacrifice, not altruism. Then what else? Now moving up toward the politics of it, kind of an intermediary between ethics and politics, individualism versus collectivism. The respect for the individual, the recognition of the person, the separateness of persons, as some political philosophers call it. That individuals are individual entities and should not be sacrificed to the collective. Leading to private ownership and control. That flows from egoism and individualism, doesn't it? I own it. I own, I, the ego, own. It's mine. I created it. I traded for it. It's mine. Versus public ownership or state ownership. That follows from collectivism, doesn't it? If the collective is all important, then the state and the collective and the public shall own and control things. Under capitalism, you also get rights, that familiar litany: life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. You don't get those things advocated in collectivist societies. There are duties. You are duty bound as an individual to serve the collective. You don't have rights. You have duties. And then finally, the political form, usually some kind of constitutionalism, representative government, or versus statism, just full of authoritarians and autocrats. Unabashedly autocratic, unabashedly authoritarian. No division of powers, no separation of powers or checks and balances. Anyway, so those are just some of the roots of pillars of it. So this is why Ayn Rand would say something like, I'm not primarily an advocate of capitalism, but of egoism. And I'm not primarily an advocate of egoism, but of reason. Notice she's going down my list on the pillars. But notice she says, if you recognize the supremacy of reason, all the rest follows. Wow, really? If you recognize, I mean, what's under attack today in the postmodernist movement, as Professor Hicks has amply documented? Postmodernism. Everything's subjective, everything's identity-based, everything is arbitrary. No, objectivity itself is seen as a bias. No one could be objective. Reason is unreliable. Reason is illusory. Well, Rand's saying, if you just defend that, the rest follow. I mean, more is needed. It's not going to be an automatic argument. I'm not primarily an advocate of capitalism, but of egoism, not of egoism, but reason. This might help because there's lots of confusion about the terminology. If I'm saying that capitalism is the optimal habitat for humanity, how do we classify, think about these other systems? Even socialists will say that socialism is public control of the means of production. It's a little narrow, actually, but I'm defining here as ownership and control of property. Or that's a broader concept. Means of production are just like factories and tools and stuff like that, right? But you own personal property. Cars, clothing, toothbrushes. Why isn't that publicly owned? Like everyone owns my toothbrush. I don't have a right to. Because the socialists wouldn't go that far. It sounds a little bit crazy. So the products are private, but the way we make them isn't. Set aside that inherent contradiction in Marxian socialism. And include your person. Do you own yourself? Do you have property in yourself at least, or are you a slave? So let's broaden this concept to the means of production, the products of production, and yourself. And what are the systems? They split by ownership and control. Capitalism is private ownership and private control. Across the board. You own yourself and your stuff, and you get to control it. The necessary of control is important. It isn't just, well, I have title to my car, but I can't control my car. Other people are driving my car. No, you need a control as well. That's part of the property right? To trade it, sell it, use it, destroy it if you want, gift it to your kids. See all the elements of ownership. So control, well, socialism is the diametrically opposed. It's public, across the board, state ownership and control of property. But fascism is a hybrid. So is feudalism. They're hybrids. Fascism doesn't actually get rid of ownership. It gets rid of private control. You can own your factory in Germany, but you're going to make tanks for the Fuhrer. And even in America, you can't say it's moving towards socialism because no one's nationalizing the means of production, right? Even Bernie Sanders, AOC, Obama, they're accused of being socialists. They're not socialists, but they're not capitalists either. They have, and the right as well has it, big advocates of controlling things, not so much nationalizing things. So the move is from capitalism to fascism in America and most of the West. That's where the movement's. This was very big in the 30s till people recoiled and saw how horrible it was, but there's a movement back 100 years later in that direction. Notice socialism. The Soviet Union disbanded in 1991. Socialism doesn't work. Assuming, by the way, that socialists want peace, prosperity, and security. So the presumption was that they wanted those things and failed to deliver. But maybe they didn't want those things and succeeded enormously in eradicating them. But so the trend is not toward socialism. And even interestingly in China and in some other places which started in socialism, they are moving toward capitalism, but via fascism. They're freeing up things in China and privatizing things, but it's obviously not a capitalist regime, right? But it's also not this anymore. So the conservatives are wrong even on that side to say, China is socialist. No, it isn't. It's moving away. It has been since 1978. Anyway, kind of a template for characterizing not only ideologies, but where countries are going. Any questions on that, by the way? Feudalism we'll set aside. It's literally the private control and public ownership. What is that? Peasants on the Lord's farm? Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Look what happened to The Wealth of Nations afterwards. I'm not saying the book caused it. The book partly caused it. But if the book wouldn't have been written had prior to 1776, there hadn't been some evidence that the wealth of nations seems to be growing. And up to then, the idea was always zero-sum. Win-lose. If someone's prospering, they must be making you not prosper. They must be stealing it from you. It was a very common view because they hadn't had capitalism yet. We were still kind of animalistic, if you will. Dog eat dog, truly dog eat dog. And then capitalism comes along and gets rid of the dog eat dog approach. And now the dogs are, the analogy breaks down. They're feeding and feasting and they're perfectly happy little dogs and they're growing and the population is growing. But look at what this is. This is real GDP per capita. So we're taking out inflation. It's real, not inflated. And we're adjusting for population, which, by the way, is growing enormously, and still output per person is massively growing. But look how late it takes China to join the fund, right? So in 1949, they had a communist revolution with Mao. So they're still like scraping along the bottom until they liberalize in 1978. Start liberalizing. And then they start joining because they moved toward capitalism away from socialism. By the way, look how much this faint green and yellow, this faint green went all the way down here. See that? Right there. See those plunges before they went back? World War II. Germany and Japan. See how far you can fall when you adopt socialism and fascism? They fell that much. They destroyed that much in terms of real GDP. And of course, they're at war. They're breaking things and killing people. They're not producing wealth. Malthus famously said, Reverend Malthus, who was a political economist also, 1798 wrote an essay on population saying, this relates to environmentalism. The world's going to end in not 12 years, but maybe 22. Why? What was the theory? Population is growing faster than food. Food production is not growing as fast as population. Conclusion? Mass starvation, eventually. So had he seen, the John Deere company had not been invented yet. Tractors, factories, agribusiness, the most despised agribusiness. That mechanization on the farm and the use of fertilizers and irrigation systems, all capitalist inventions, would enormously increase food production per person. To the point where, in 1800, 35 or 40% of the US population was farming. Today, it's 2%. So it goes from 35% to 40 to 2%. It's meaning we're all starving? No, meaning those 2% produce enough food, more than enough food for what now? 330 million Americans. Whereas a third of the labor force fed, I don't know how many it was in 18, 30 million? Due to capitalism, due to technology on the farm. So he famously said, I think the population is going to grow geometrically. But resources are only growing arithmetically. No. To this day, a Malthusian outlook, it's an adjective now, depicts this kind of inability to foresee what capitalists will do. A kind of phobia and fear or trend extrapolation of existing trends. And being a bad forecast. We have now, global population is 8 billion. When he wrote, it was less than 1 billion. If you had just told him this, if you just set aside Malthus after he produced the essays, here's some graphs that are going to happen in the next 200 years. And then just say to him, and that's a fact, so tell me, what do you think happened? I'm just curious to see what he would say.
And actually, I'm just thinking about what you're saying about Malthus.
Yeah.
If we go back one slide.
Uh-huh.
And Malthus may have looked at the short version of Smith's book title. What's the full title?
Yes, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations.
Yeah, those are the parts you see to it just struck me that.
Yeah.
The nature and causes of wealth.
Right. And Smith's insight, I'm thinking capital, yes, kind of makes people more productive, division of labor, specialization. Smith did have this theory that once you specialize, you're more likely to look for labor-saving devices, which means you're likely to invent things that replace labor. That's the beginning of technology, in fact. But the issue here is, could anyone imagine that on a farm? That's what was unique. I'm not even sure Smith was there. The idea is, well, I can imagine that in a factory, but in the fields? How does that work in the fields? It wasn't obvious that the fields, the agricultural sector, would do the same. Professor Hicks?
So if you go to Malthus,
Yes.
1798 publication day.
I'll go back one slide.
Yes. Where it is.
He had that data available to him up to 1798, so he's a good empiricist. Is it really unreasonable to extrapolate, if the manipulate the resources is only going to be modest or arithmetic, not
Geometric thing.
Do you hear that question? It's a good question. As an empiricist, I would agree. But these are supposed to be theorists. A theorist doesn't just get the data. A theorist gets the data and knows something about human nature and what's happened so far, and is the system changing, and have we had the Magna Carta yet, and have we had the American Revolution, the French Revolution yet? Okay, they're not all prescient, right? But the really prescient ones combine empiricism, this would be my answer if you have a better one, let me, with a knowledge of the nature of causality, the nature of things, and then have a better forecast. Here would be an example. Wow, I do see textiles and the advance in productivity there. I wonder if that could be transported to the farm. I wonder if it is being transported to the farm. Oh, if so, imagine what that essay would have been. He would have been like really more famous than he is now if he had said, wow, Malthus in 1798 made the connection between productivity advances in the factory and productivity advances in the field and projected this enormous improvement in agricultural output. Anyway, what do you think of that answer? Is that no?
Well, I think it might get
Pure empiricism versus a theory, a cause.
trying to be a little more sympathetic to Malthus.
Yeah.
While empiricist.
Yes.
But then your larger point is about Malthusians.
Yes.
Once they became,
An adjective, then you've got several differentiations to it.
Right.
and you've got much better theoretical analysis.
Yes.
And a huge amount of empirical data, so it's
Right.
still hostile
Yes.
than something else.
Yes. I've often used this to stress to people. I think there's a difference between a Malthusian in 1798 and a Malthusian in 1998 because so much evidence has come in. Like now it's like, now what are you? Talk about deniers. Now what are you denying? Or often say, just to be charitable, a socialist in 1916, pro-socialist in 1916 versus 2016. I say 1916 because it's a year before the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks took over, right? So, okay, one, you could be naive and maybe stupid to think that socialism would be a good economic system, but after 25 experiments and 100 million people dead, you would think in 2016 you'd be not an advocate of socialism. So here's Professor Hicks has it right. Here's an example of someone in 1968, famously Paul Ehrlich, saying same kind of Malthusian stuff. Quote, this is in 1968, the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of million people will starve to death despite any crash programs embarked upon now, unquote, population bomb. We should depopulate because it's still a humanistic argument, isn't it? It's bad for people to have more people. I just found this chart and I thought, what could Ehrlich have known? Well, first of all, between 1798 and 1968, he knew there was an agricultural revolution, and by then the planet was 6 billion people. Still not impressed, though. He wasn't impressed. So I found a chart from 1940. Population, and then mortality from famine. I mean, it's the closest stat I could find to, are we actually running out of food and there's famine? Now, famines may be due to socialist regimes. Of course they are. But let's just say they're due to the weather or the inability to keep up. The point is, he already knew the numbers. In 1968, if he was empiricist, he would already know that the mortality rates had plummeted, despite population growing a lot. And then after 1968, it was the same thing. Still more plummeting in the mortality rate from famine and more populations. That just can't be true. That population is causing that. And yet, the reason I brought this up is not because I care about 1968. He was on 60 Minutes in 2023, and they were heralding him. He had a big interview on CBS Sunday night. Still with the apocalyptic forecast. There are various measures of poverty adjusted over time. Look at the plummeting in the number of people, the percentage of people. Globally, percentage of the world population living in extreme poverty, obviously the opposite is not living in extreme poverty. It has gone from 90% living in extreme poverty to less than 10%. And again, the Industrial Revolution started in the 1750s. This is due entirely to the more industrial, technological, capitalist assistance. If you just took, this is world population, if you just took out all the socialist regimes, it would be even better. Because they're the ones holding up this progress. So it's not like you can say, well, we have a mixed system today. Maybe this part did it, maybe that part did it. No, the numbers are clear that if you put in China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, and elsewhere, they make these numbers worse, not better. All right, let's finish up. It's supposed to stop at 11, I think. It's 11:15. I have a seminar at Duke that I teach for students. The seminars are limited to 18 kids, and it's called Capitalism For and Against. So half the readings are pro-capitalist reading from a PP&E perspective, so a philosophic, economic, political arguments for. But half the readings are anti-capitalist. Those are much easier to find, so Marx and Keynes and others. But one of the exercises I have them go through, they kind of fill out a template as we go through all the readings and all the schools, is to ask a question: do these thinkers and these writers, first of all, how do they define capitalism? That's a big starting point. Like if you start with the system by which capitalists exploit labor, that's the Marxist definition. You've smuggled your premise into the, or they could say, well, Ayn Rand says it's private property and there's mutual, so she's loading it up too, you could argue. But let's just start with, is it moral, practical, and sustainable? What's their answer? What does Marx say about the morality, practicality, sustainability of capitalism? What does Keynes say? What does Rand say? What do the libertarians say? What do religious people say? What do feminists say? So go through the whole litany. And now the sustainability part's interesting for this talk, right? Because what if environmentalists argue? Capitalism is sustainable or not? Not. Why?
Because it's currently destroying the environment.
Yeah, so the environmentalist view would be it's not sustainable because it's eating up the planet and, you know, it's frying us. And there's too much population. This would be capitalism left unchecked. So capitalism, you know, by its own devices, is not sustainable because of it basically killing the entire planet, the one upon which it relies. It might even say it's practical. Notice how weird that is. Marx said that. In the Communist Manifesto, there are whole passages where Marx just glowed, well, he's not happy about it, but he recounts the actual truth of the productive increase and productive abundance of capitalism. So he's not saying it doesn't produce the goods. Then he's saying, yeah, but it does so by exploiting labor. The environmentalists say it does so by exploiting the planet. It's the same template. Now, the moral part gets down to, remember the pillars I had? If it's based on egoism and self-interest, and those motives are suspect, which they have been historically, you know, even in ancient Greco-Roman times, there was suspicion of it, but especially in medieval period, right? Money, love of money is the root of all evil. It's going to be easier for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, to pass through the eye of a needle than enter the kingdom of heaven. There's a conflict between pursuing God and mammon, money. And the more hysteria and animosity towards self-interest and money-making, the more depressed and backward and crude, as they called it, the Dark Ages, that the economies would be, right? Ayn Rand's view, actually, is one of the rare cases where she says, it's moral, practical, and sustainable. You can't really get that combination in the other. The others will say, it's, religionists might say, it's moral because it produces so much goods, we can be philanthropic and give it away. Notice the moral argument is not that the money makers and the wealth makers are moral, or that the result is moral. It's moral if they give it away, not if they make it. They're kind of like absolving their sins, right? So like Bill Gates, when he was making a fortune with Microsoft, was hated and trust busted. He's a robber baron. When did he become saintly? When he quit. When he quit and started the Gates Foundation, started giving the money away. So moral, like by what standard? But putting the case positively, here's how I put it in my book. That capitalism is the only legitimate habitat for humanity. And now back into it. It's sustainable because it's practical. But it's practical because it's moral. And then it's moral because it's egoistic. And egoistic because that's the rational ethic. And then even deeper. If you're for rationality, that's natural. That's human nature. So there's the whole thing consonant with human nature. So you need all of this, and it's sequential in a way, or structural, I should say, hierarchical. No argument for capitalism lacking these elements or denying their logical dependency can withstand scrutiny or win the day. That's my talk on capitalism in the human environment. So I think we have 10 minutes, Bill, or so. We stop at 11, and I'd be glad to stop at 11. Okay. Thoughts and questions, comments, criticisms? Go back to any graph you want or exhibit. Yeah, Professor Hicks.
Back to the first part of your talk, the beginning of analysis of some of the flip-flopping on environmental issues, is cooling, is warming, and some of the people like AOC and the kid. I mean, she's not a kid anymore. She's now an adult. But often wondered if we take environmentalism kind of as a movement. All movements have factions, and they come to the movement from different motivations. So, but we said, I understand there are people who are ideological. They're, for whatever reason, just hate capitalism. They're always looking at or anything to attack capitalism with, and if environmentalism can help or attack capitalism, I'm on board with that. That's not to dismiss that as ideological argument. But in the movement, there are still significant number of people who never live about capitalism, but they're on board with environmentalism. So they're also, it might often see that they're not saying that human beings are not part of nature or some sort of alien force. I get that human beings are part of nature, but just like you're saying, human beings really are distinctive in the power of their reason, their science, and their technology. And so for this person, it's more of a fear of, have we unleashed a Pandora's box? And will there be unintended consequences? And we just don't know. So I'm an environmentalist because I want to play it safe, not because I hate capitalism and ideology.
Right.
So it's from a kind of a safety and ignorance. But using ignorance in a neutral position. That's a different kind of argument that needs to be addressed. How we are going to get people to be confident about our ability to solve problems as they arise, et cetera, et cetera. And it's also there's a third big contingent, that's the scientists, and the scientists are divided over all of these issues as well. Many scientists who are part of the movement, they're not starting off as ideological, and they're not looking about opening Pandora's boxes necessarily, but they're academics. And academics like their models and they got their theories, and it's hard for them in many cases to make a connection to the real world. They're in Eisenhower. And the way a lot of this goes is that we build models.
Right.
And in my model, I've got all of the chemicals that make up the atmosphere, and play around with the numbers a little bit. If you tweak the numbers and the percentages of the various chemicals in this direction, then disaster happens. And you tweak them in this direction just a little bit, another kind of disaster happens. And so I become an environmentalist, again, not because I'm particularly ignorant or because I'm an ideologist, because I've got the best model I can. And whichever way I treat the model, just disaster happens. And so that's where I'm coming from. So setting aside the ideologists, do we need to have more fleshed out arguments for the other two views of people? That's where our thinking is right now.
My answer is yes. On two counts, yes, those groups exist. Call them the less ideological, the more, the less informed but still worried, those making kind of like a Pascal's wager. Well, maybe I shouldn't believe in God, but that'd be a safe thing to do, because if I don't, I might end up in hell. And that other group, yes, the scientists, although many of them publicly funded to be one way or another, so they're not always objective. I think absolutely right that those are part of this orbit, call it environment. This is part of this environment of environmentalists. The first group that I focus on, the reason I focus here on what in the literature is called deep ecology, the ones who believe that nature apart from man has intrinsic worth. They call it existence value, by the way. If you look up existence value, things have value apart from humans. And then, premise one. Premise two, humans are not natural, so they're outside of this thing, so we wouldn't even intrinsically value humans. It becomes a very anti-humanistic philosophy. The humanist environmentalists, although I hate to call them environmentalists, the humanist ecologists or whatever, their answer will always be, I'm worried about this because it'll do something to humans. That's a much better group. And they're easier, I think, to debate because now you're on the same premise of, are we really talking about what's best for humans? And guess what? I have a system for you called capitalism, which I try to advocate. But the other reason I focus on this is notice AOC, John Kerry, previously Al Gore. I think it's very important that if you get political environmentalism, what I call political environment, namely people who are literally coercing us into anti-capitalist moves, banning, fossil fuels, banning combustion engine cars and things like that. All the effects we're beginning to see on our appliances or our flush toilets or things like that. To me, now this is it is like straight coercion. Now, if they're influenced by ideology, it probably is important to focus. I think it's important to focus on them first, even though they seem like real outliers. Once they get control of the reins of government, they impose a kind of unanimous result that would not come from just people debating, in an environmental department about this degree or that degree. Those people are innocuous comparatively. So they exist, but in my view, if they're not actually in the political realm succeeding in their argument, which they aren't, they've been marginalized, and the marginal views are actually politicized, that's a very dangerous combination. So, but I agree with you. I think the biggest thing polemically we should pick up on this is if you critique environmentalism, I prefer just to defend capitalism, but if you critique the environmentalist critique of cap and only focus on what you call the ideologues, it'll seem like a straw man. So just from what we look like from our standpoint, it does not look, and it isn't, as an objective approach as to say, well, there's an orbit of environmentalists and they range in these three different groups, as you say, and they need maybe a different handling of what evidence they're shown or how they're treated as being, should be given the benefit of the doubt or not. I don't know if that makes any sense. But yes, there are milder, if you will, forms. Yes, Professor. Professor Korn.
Sorry, I wasn't I have your backups now what because so you may have covered this. But if we step back for a second, I just or
Yeah.
and I want to ask if you just list two ideas. So, running up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was socialism with creation of the paradoxically consumer good and below right capital. That was your argument. That's what's famous. We know that be absolutely nothing better at producing for the common person and giving them more stuff or wealth and capital.
Yeah.
So the Marxists all of a sudden disappear out of it. Mainly how do economics, they will go to business settings. And then somebody lights upon, and this is brilliant. So if your strength is to produce the most consumer goods, we have global warming. The production of CO2 is what's harming the earth. Producing CO2 is sort of concomitant with producing more consumer goods. So there's no system that produces more CO2 than capitalism, and that's why it's to me. Have you seen that kind of, do you understand that train of thought?
Yeah.
So now the strength of capitalism, which was more, is its Achilles heel.
Yes.
In this debate.
Yes. Actually, I would name three broad aspects of this same argument. But think of how it's gone. It's gone from macro to micro. It's gone from micro to macro in the following sense. First, capitalism exploits the worker. What is the worker? That is usually in factories, not even in farms. That is a subset of the labor market. It's very micro. It's a false view, but that the initial Marxist view is capitalist exploits the worker. That's mid-1800s. By 1900, Marxists said, no. Even Marxists said, there's no evidence of this. And it shifted to democratic socialism in Britain. They went from revolutionary to evolutionary. Change not by bullets, but by ballots. Try to convince people to vote in socialism, because these people are not going to revolt. We tried to get them to revolt. They're not revolted by capitalism. They're benefiting by it. So that was a big embarrassment. The next phase, though, wasn't the one we're talking about today. The intermediate phase, which was a little more macro, is they must be treating the domestic worker well because they're exploiting the third world. The 50s, 60s, and 70s was very much capitalism exploits the third world. The multinational. And so now it's not just Mr. Factory Owner Carnegie is exploiting Pittsburgh laborers. Now it's the multinational company is exploiting the third world. That's how they're getting away with, now they're going to impoverish. See how it's bigger? And now what you get is anti-globalization. Now you get the idea is we're not just worried about capitalism in Detroit or Pittsburgh. We're worried about capitalism spreading. Okay, but then it spreads to China. 1978? It's earlier than this. There are other cases after World War II, right, where West Germany outcompetes easily East Germany, right? And South Korea outperforms North Korea. So all these like natural experiments, oh my God, capitalism is showing itself all over the globe as superior. We're losing that argument. It doesn't really exploit the third world worker. China has brought 450 million people out of dire poverty by just going a little bit toward capitalism. Okay, so that doesn't work anymore. Now it's exploiting the planet. See how now that's super macro. It isn't just the Pittsburgh workers, the people of Africa. It's the entire globe. Capitalism is threatening and the entire globe. Notice how it's the same template. But now, in many ways, it's more dangerous because the indictment is humanity. Not a subset of humanity, the capitalist. Not even a somewhat bigger subset, the multinationalist. It's now humans. Humans are exploiting the planet. And just as Marxists wanted to dispossess and kill the capitalist, I hate to say it, but certain extremists, granted, just prefer depopulation. Literally prefer policies which like if sustainable energy, renewable, so to speak. The calculations have been done. If you went, and many of them want to go quickly, if you went right to renewables now and got rid of all fossil fuels, and some of them have 10-year plans of doing this, but even if you substantially downgrade the contribution of fossil fuels and nuclear, which they're against, even though it doesn't have emissions, which is kind of a litmus test of what they're looking for, it would support maybe 3 billion people, maybe less. 2 billion people? That means you'd have to get rid of 6 billion people. You'd have to literally institute what Malthus feared. But you do it by design. You do it intentionally. This isn't just Malthus sitting back saying, I fear this will happen. These are people advocating that it happen. This is misanthropic on a very deep level. Misanthropy means hatred for humans. There's very, very much concern about misogyny, which exists, hatred for women. I think misandry is hatred for men. But misanthropy is hatred for all of them, the hatred for humans. And it is odd, but it's because we have volition. It is odd to see humans being anti-human. I mean, you just don't see giraffes like being anti-giraffe. There's very little species loathing or species hatred or it's a very bizarre thing. Even in the animal world, you don't get that. Yeah.
Professor Hicks rightly brought up other versions of environmentalism that would need to be taken seriously for this sense and have, undertake different sorts of arguments.
Yeah.
What about free market environmentalists?
Yeah, the phrase free market environmentalism, their view is if you see problems like pollution or degradation of any natural, their view is, and it's a correct view actually, is privatize. There's a famous essay from the late 60s called Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin. And interestingly, he's not a pro-capitalist. Hardin's view was the tragedy is if you have commons, commonly owned property, it will be dissipated and overused and people won't cultivate it because they're not looking long range, right? So really it's an argument against communalism, community ownership, and for private ownership. But his answer was the solution to the tragedy is to regulate access, to have the government, regulate, put lands off limit or, so use a more fascistic approach. We don't nationalize, but we don't privatize either completely. We control something in between. So the free market environmentalists take that and say, we don't want a tragedy of the commons either. So the answer is don't have commons. The answer is privatize everything. including, the oceans or the skies. And their only problem is if they saw environmentalism, the ism part of it, as fundamentally anti-technology anyway, you can't get most environmentalists advocating private property. And this is true of all elements too. It's not just the extremists. They don't want private property. So that central aspect of capitalism, which they don't want, if you say to them, so you want a tragedy of the commons? That's what your friend Garrett Hardin told us. He told us if you keep things in common hands, they'll either won't be available for human development. Look at Anwar in Alaska. Once they realized there was a massive oil in Alaska, they didn't say, go get the oil. They said, don't get the oil, the environmentalists. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, there's an attempt by free market people to say, we have an answer and we're not anti-environment.
Oh, I guess that part, like, when free market environmentalists are defending ways of addressing what might be considered environmental problems, you mentioned about pollution, et cetera, and to what extent do you think that, could you say a bit more about that as an alternative? Just say privatize is kind of broad, like what would be involved in that would, they argue, solve problems of the human environment, we could call it. So how would they specify environmentalism on a market perspective? And what are their solutions for using markets?
Yeah, well,
how does that solve some of these problems that people bring?
They either say privatize the thing, or they'll say, for example, trading emissions, and create permits where you can trade emissions. They've had that. And various other things, congestion pricing and stuff like that. But their premise is that the environmentalists are not anti-capitalist or anti-private property or anti-human. Their premise is these environmentalists must just want clean air and clean water, and which was what they called the ecology movement. It wasn't called environmentalism, it was called the ecology movement in the 60s and 70s. And those people generally wanted clean air and clean water. But once some of them learned that that's what capitalism delivers, catalytic converters on exhaust pipes or scrubbers on smokestacks and water treatment plants. So the same technology of capitalism that they hated, we're solving these problems. But if they're still fundamentally anti-capitalist, they don't want that either, because they still exist, right? Those are you call the extreme ones. But that's really all they're doing. The free market environmentalists do come up with institutional solutions to curb, air and water quality problems and other problems using market mechanisms. But it would require the environmentalists to say, yeah, we believe in private property, contracting, market mechanisms. And to that extent, they do reach out to those kind of groups. But it's not a huge part of I don't think it's a huge part of the environmentalist movement.
Sure, but it would be funny to tell we can call them environmentalists with a biggie, to say they're not the real environmentalists.
Yeah.
Real environmentalists are the ones who have technological solutions to the problems of solving the human that come up in a human environment.
Yeah, I've, for historical and other reasons, but also for conceptual reasons, I've gotten to the point where I refer to someone when I talk to them, they'll say, if they are at all humanist, and I can tell they're saying, I want clean air and clean water for humans, or we need to do this to preserve long-term use. Ecologists. In other words, they care about the environment, but for man. But if they're these other types, I call them environmentalists or environmentalism, because isms suggest ideology, just like capitalism, socialism. The fact that there's ism, I don't think you could find the word environmentalism in the 70s and 80s. I looked. It's interesting that the word started developing in the 90s. And so it's like that's when ecology wedded to ideology. And their view was, it's an ism, and we're just against capitalism, but we're going to use the environment as a cudgel. And previously what had been used, the laborer in Pittsburgh, or the third world who was exploited, and now we're going to champion this constituent called the earth. And who's going to be against us? Who could say we're not human, But the difference between the humanist, Alex Epstein's been very good about this. Check on the grounds of humanism. Humanism is the idea that I prioritize humans, and it shouldn't be surprising that humans prioritize themselves. But even that is seen as immoral, because it sounds egoistic. I, as human, advocate human. I, as Richard, advocate Richard. I put Richard first. I put America first. I put human first, right? They think of that as it's just a version of egoism. You need to be much more selfless and concerning of others. You see, so they sometimes will call it species bias. Did you ever hear that? They accuse you of species, but why are you a bias toward humans? Others? It's 11:08, I went over. All right, thank you all for coming and listening.